So, let's get right into it. Back in 1962, a marine biologist named Rachel Carson published a book that, and I'm not exaggerating here, ignited an absolute firestorm. It was called Silent Spring, and it used this incredible mix of rock-solid science and beautiful, almost poetic language to pull back the curtain on the dark side of a chemical revolution that was silently poisoning the entire planet.
Now, what's so brilliant is that Carson didn't open with a bunch of charts or dry data. Nope, she started with a story, a chapter she called A Fable for Tomorrow. It paints this picture of a gorgeous, lively American town that suddenly falls under some kind of mysterious blight, a town where the birds have just vanished and the spring has fallen silent. It is such a chilling and unforgettable way to frame the crisis.
But here's the thing. This wasn't some fantasy novel. Carson made it crystal clear that while this specific town didn't exist, it was a composite, a story she had pieced together from very real disasters that were already happening. She was warning everyone that her fable for tomorrow was already becoming a reality in towns and communities all over the country.
So what was causing this blight? Well, Carson pointed her finger directly at what she called the elixirs of death. See, after World War II, chemicals that were developed for war found a new life in agriculture and even in our suburbs. This led to an absolute explosion in synthetic pesticides, and they were being used on a scale nobody had ever seen before.
And when I say explosion, I mean it. The scale of this was just breathtaking. In just a little over a decade, U.S. production of these chemicals shot up by more than 5 times. We're not talking about some niche product here. This was hundreds of millions of pounds of brand new poisons being blanketed across the entire country year after year.
Carson's argument was that our very own language was hiding the danger. Think about it. The term insecticide, it literally just means insect killer. It sounds so targeted, so precise, so reassuring. But she said that was a dangerously misleading label for what these chemicals really were.
So she came up with a new term, a much more honest one: biocides, life killers. Because these chemicals, they weren't like surgical strikes. They were, in her own words, non-selective chemicals that have the power to kill every insect, the good and the bad, to still the song of birds and the leaping of fish in the streams. They were poisoning the whole living world.
And this distinction was absolutely critical. You know, before the war, insecticides were usually made from natural stuff, like minerals or plants. But these new post-war chemicals, like DDT, they were a whole different ballgame. They were totally synthetic, man-made compounds with what Carson called an enormous biological potency, a power to kill that was far, far beyond anything nature had ever come up with.
Now, this is where Carson's background as a biologist was so important. She knew that these poisons didn't just get sprayed and then disappear. No, they entered the environment and began this sinister journey up the food chain, a process we now call bioaccumulation.
Her own words really nail it. Unlike older chemicals that might break down, these new ones were persistent. They were also fat-soluble, which is key. It means they get lodged in the fatty tissues of animals and just stay there, building up in concentration every single time one animal eats another. The story of Clear Lake in California is the perfect, horrifying example of how this works. Officials wanted to control some gnats, so they applied a chemical called DDT to the lake at what would seem like a ridiculously tiny dose, 1 part per 50 million. But that poison didn't go away. It was absorbed by the microscopic plankton. Then fish ate the plankton. And at the very top of that food chain were these beautiful birds called grebes, which ate the fish.
And the final result was just staggering. When the grebes started dying off in huge numbers, scientists analyzed their bodies. The chemical concentration in their tissues was 1,600 parts per million. Think about that. A minuscule, almost undetectable amount of poison in the water had been biologically magnified into a lethal dose at the top of the food chain.
And then Carson turned the lens from the wildlife directly onto us. She warned that these same chemicals were being stored in human bodies too. They were showing up in mother's milk and probably passing to unborn babies. They were known to be toxic to the liver, they could mess with our nervous systems, and she pointed to some really disturbing links with a rise in cancers like leukemia. But here's the ultimate irony that Carson uncovered. This whole chemical war, this brute force attack on nature, it wasn't just destructive, it was failing. In fact, a lot of the time, it was actually making the insect problems even worse. What was happening was basically evolution in fast forward. When you douse a huge population of insects with poison, you're really just artificially selecting for the toughest ones.
The few bugs that happen to have some natural resistance, they survive, they breed, and pretty soon you've created what Carson called a super race of resistant insects.
And the results were swift and predictable. Before all these synthetic pesticides, finding a resistant insect species was rare. By 1960, that number had jumped by more than 10 times. We were creating an unwinnable chemical arms race, what Carson called the rumblings of an avalanche.
And to add insult to injury, these biocides, remember, were indiscriminate. They killed the pest you were aiming for, sure, but they also wiped out all of its natural predators and parasites, the very things in nature that kept it under control. This often led to something called a flare-back, where the pest population would rebound, sometimes to numbers even higher than before you started spraying.
But, and this is so important, Carson's book was not a message of doom and gloom. She saved her final chapters for what she called the other road, a path of intelligent biological solutions that are based on working with nature, not declaring war on it.
She contrasted these two approaches so brilliantly. You have the chemical superhighway. It's a quick fix, sure, but it leads to resistance, ecological chaos, and toxic chemicals everywhere. Or you could take the other road, the biological one. It's more thoughtful, it's smarter, and it aims for permanent, stable control by using nature's own systems.
And the ingenuity of these alternatives was just incredible. Things like sterilizing male insects so they can't reproduce, using an insect's own hormones to lure it into a trap, or even using specific bacteria that only kill one type of pest. Carson was showing us there were all these smarter, safer ways to solve our problems.
And in the end, this is the choice she leaves us with. Silent Spring wasn't just a book of warnings. It was a powerful, empowering call to action. It was a reminder that we have the right to know what's being done to our world, and we have the power to demand a different path. And that question she posed, well, more than 60 years later, it feels just as urgent as it did the day she wrote it.